At 300 feet down, in total darkness, breathing gas that would kill you at the surface, you stop thinking of yourself as a person with a name. You're a function. 9 ranks separate a diving school dropout from the handful of people qualified to work at that depth at all, and the industry that pays for it spends more insuring your life on a single job than most companies spend insuring an entire fleet of trucks. Almost nobody on land has any idea this trade exists at the level it actually operates at, which somehow makes the water feel lonelier rather than more exclusive. Level 1. The dive school student. You're 20 and you've just spent $15,000, most of it borrowed, on a commercial diving program that promises to turn recreational scuba experience into an actual trade. It isn't the same sport at all. You spend the first week learning to work entirely by feel in zero visibility, welding underwater with your mask fogged and your hands numb, breathing through equipment that fails on purpose during training so you learn what failure feels like before it happens somewhere it can kill you. An instructor named Otis, a diver with 3 decades in the industry and a knee that never healed right after a decompression injury nobody talks about directly, runs the deep water module personally, and he fails a third of every class he ever teaches without apology. This industry doesn't need optimists, he tells you, on your first day, flatly, the way a man says something he's said 100 times and still means every time. He has you practice removing your own helmet underwater and replacing it by feel, over and over, until the panic that shows up the first dozen times stops showing up at all. Not because the danger becomes less real, he tells you, but because you become the kind of person who can function calmly inside it. It needs people who respect the water more than they respect their own confidence. You watch 2 classmates wash out in the same week for exactly the reason he described. You graduate. You're not entirely sure yet whether you belong in the 2/3 who made it or the 1/3 who didn't. The 2 classmates who wash out don't fail because they can't hold their breath or can't weld a clean seam. One of them freezes, completely and involuntarily, the first time his mask floods during a controlled drill, and no amount of coaching from Otis brings him back from it by the end of the week. The other simply admits, quietly, to the whole class, that he didn't understand until this exact program what the job actually asks of a person, and that he doesn't want it after all. Nobody mocks either of them on the way out. Everyone in the room understands, watching them go, that the water doesn't negotiate with anyone's confidence, including their own. You take a part-time job at a hardware store the same month you enroll, because the loan covers tuition and nothing close to rent, and you spend 6 months living on almost nothing, driving a car with a check engine light you can't afford to look at, telling yourself the math will eventually work out the way the recruiter's brochure promised it would. It does, eventually, not for a long while yet. Level 2. The tender. Your first job doesn't involve diving at all. You're a tender, surface crew, managing the diver's air hose and communications line, running equipment, standing ready to respond if anything goes wrong 40 feet below you. It pays around $38,000 a year, less than plenty of jobs that don't require your training, and every diver on the crew treats the position as the only real way to earn trust before anyone lets you go down yourself. Otis, it turns out, still occasionally works dives when a crew is short-handed, and you end up tending his line for 6 months on an inshore inspection contract. He corrects you once, sharply, for a moment's inattention on his air supply during a routine dive, and the correction lands harder than anything from dive school did, because you understand, immediately and completely, that your inattention could have actually killed him. You never make that specific mistake again. You make others. Everyone does, at this level, which is exactly why it exists. Better to learn on a tender's rope than on a diver's air supply. You spend most of that year learning the job's actual rhythm rather than its danger. The specific choreography of hoses and communication checks and equipment logs that has to happen correctly, in order, every single time, with no room for the kind of improvisation that other trades tolerate. You watch senior divers you'll work under for years run through the same pre-dive checklist thousands of times without ever visibly rushing it. and you understand, watching them, that the checklist isn't caution for its own sake. It's the only reason any of them are still alive to be doing it thousands of times. Level 3, the surface supplied diver. You're finally diving for pay. Harbor work, hull inspections, underwater welding and cutting, all of it in water shallow enough to breathe compressed air rather than the exotic gas mixtures deeper work requires. The pay jumps to around $55,000, and the work is genuinely dangerous in ways nobody outside the trade appreciates. Zero visibility in most harbors, entanglement risk in debris and cable, the constant low-grade danger of working blind by touch around machinery that's still technically operational. You take on a hull cleaning job in near-zero visibility that goes wrong when your air hose snags on wreckage below the ship, and you spend 4 of the longest minutes of your life working the tangle free by feel alone, unable to see your own hands, talking yourself through it out loud inside your helmet because the sound of your own voice is the only thing keeping the panic manageable. You surface. You take the next job 2 days later. Otis tells you when you describe it to him that the 4 minutes you just survived are the actual entrance exam for this trade, more than anything dive school taught you. You take on more of this kind of work over the following year, pier inspections, propeller clearing, cable burial checks, and you develop a specific, private catalog of harbors you trust and harbors you don't, based on nothing you could fully explain to someone outside the trade. Visibility, current, what's likely to be tangled on the bottom from decades of shipping traffic. You get offered steady, well-paying inshore work that would let you stay near home indefinitely. You turn it down the following spring for an offshore contract that pays less predictably and asks considerably more of you, because some part of you the dive school waiting list never fully explained has already decided harbor work isn't actually what you want to be doing at 40. Your family doesn't understand the decision, and you don't fully explain it, because the honest explanation, that harbor work had started to feel like coasting, and coasting felt more dangerous to you long-term than open water did short-term, sounds insane to anyone who hasn't spent 3 years learning to read a current by the pull of it against their own body. Otis is the only person you tell the real reason to. He doesn't try to talk you out of it. He just asks if you've told your mother yet, which you haven't and won't for another 2 months. Level 4, the offshore diver. You move offshore onto oil platforms in open water, working in genuinely hostile conditions, currents, cold, depths beyond what harbor work ever asked of you. Your pay jumps significantly into the low 6 figures, and the crew you work with becomes something closer to family than colleagues, because your life is now literally, routinely in each other's hands on every single job. The danger here isn't dramatic most days. It's cumulative. Cold water pulling heat from your body faster than you can replace it. Currents strong enough to physically exhaust you before a job is even half finished. Months at a time away from anyone who isn't also on this platform. A diver on a neighboring crew has a serious decompression injury during your 2nd year offshore, done everything correctly by the book, unlucky anyway, and spends months in recovery with lingering nerve damage that ends his career in deep work permanently. You understand, watching it happen to someone who did nothing wrong, that this industry's danger isn't really about mistakes. It's about a level of physical toll the body simply isn't designed to absorb indefinitely, mistake or not. The rotations offshore run weeks at a time, followed by weeks off that you spend, more often than you'd like to admit, unable to fully switch out of the hypervigilance the job demands of you. You miss birthdays, anniversaries, the small, ordinary texture of a life on land. And you start to understand why so many veteran divers you've met are on a 2nd or 3rd marriage, if they're married at all. The crew fills some of that gap. It doesn't fill all of it, and you stop pretending, sometime during your 2nd year offshore, that it ever fully will. Level 5, the saturation diver trainee. You begin training for saturation diving, the deepest and most specialized work in the industry, and the concept alone reorders how you think about the job entirely. Instead of diving down and returning to the surface each day, saturation divers live for weeks at a time inside a pressurized chamber on the surface, breathing an exotic gas mixture around the clock, only leaving the chamber pressure environment through a sealed diving bell that lowers them directly to depth and back. Your body stays saturated with gas the entire rotation. Coming back to normal atmospheric pressure too quickly at any point would kill you. Your pay crosses $100,000 during training alone, before you've done a single saturation dive for real. Otis, who spent the back half of his career in saturation work before his knee ended it, walks you through what he calls the only rule that actually matters in a chamber. Your teammates are the only people on Earth who can save you if something goes wrong at depth, and you are the only person who can save them. And there is no version of this job where that fact isn't true every single hour of a multi-week rotation. The chamber itself takes real getting used to. The constant low hiss of gas circulation, voices altered into a strange, unfamiliar register by the mixture you're all breathing. No natural daylight for weeks at a stretch. Meals passed through a small airlock by a topside crew you can hear but rarely see in person. You develop within your first real rotation an entirely new relationship with silence and with the two strangers who are about to become the people you trust with your life more completely than you've trusted almost anyone on land. Your voice comes out thin and unfamiliar through the gas mixture, a helium-altered register every saturation diver learns to understand instinctively, despite how strange it sounds the first time you hear your own words come back distorted through the intercom. You learn to read your two chambermates by small, specific signals instead. The particular way one of them goes quiet before a difficult bell run, the way the other hums almost inaudibly when the readings are exactly where they should be. 3 weeks in a space the size of a small camper turns out to teach you more about two strangers than most friendships manage in years. Level 6. The Saturation Diver. You do your first real saturation rotation. 3 weeks living inside a chamber the size of a small camper, sharing it with 2 other divers, descending in a bell to work at depths that would be instantly fatal to breathe at with anything but the precise gas mixture keeping you alive. Your pay for a single rotation can run $20,000 to $30,000, translating into an annual income well into 6 figures for a career that, realistically, has a shelf life measured in years rather than decades. The danger is total and constant in a way none of the levels before this one fully prepared you for. A single equipment failure, a hose, a valve, a seal, at 300 feet isn't survivable the way a similar failure would be in shallower work. There's no swimming to the surface from saturation depth, ever, under any circumstances, without dying from decompression on the way. You lose a diver you trained alongside at dive school to an equipment failure during your second year in saturation work, a fact you learn secondhand, days after it happened, from a phone call that changes how you think about every subsequent rotation for the rest of your career. You go back into the chamber for your next scheduled job less than 3 weeks later. There isn't really an alternative. That doesn't mean leaving the trade entirely, and you're not ready to do that yet, grief or not. You call his widow before that next rotation starts, unsure of what you're actually going to say until the words are already out, and she tells you something you carry into every chamber afterward for the rest of your career. That he loved the work more than he ever let on to the people on land, and that she'd rather you keep doing it than quit out of guilt on his behalf. You don't know, entirely, whether that absolves anything. You go back into the water anyway, the way everyone in this trade eventually has to. Your bell runs settle into a rhythm over the following years, descending in a cramped diving bell you share with a teammate, working at the bottom of the ocean in total darkness for hours at a stretch, communicating with topside through a comms line that occasionally cuts out for seconds that feel considerably longer than seconds. You get good at the actual welding and construction work at depth, genuinely skilled in a way that would be impressive on land and is simply table stakes down here. And you understand slowly that the skill was never really the hard part of this level. Living inside the risk, calmly for weeks at a time? Always was. The gas mixture changes your voice, your appetite, even your sense of taste in small, persistent ways nobody warns you about outside the trade itself, and you develop a private list of foods that simply taste wrong for the entire length of a rotation, the way some divers develop small rituals to mark the days, a specific song hummed before every bell run, a photograph taped inside the chamber wall where only you can see it. You never ask your chambermates about theirs. Everyone in saturation work seems to understand, without ever discussing it, that these small private rituals are exactly that, private. You surface from a full rotation for the first time and spend the mandatory decompression period afterward suspended in a strange, floating kind of exhaustion, your body slowly releasing weeks of dissolved gas at a controlled rate that can't be rushed at any cost. You call your family from the chamber the moment you're cleared, and you find yourself unable to explain, in any way that lands, what 3 weeks at the bottom of the ocean actually felt like from the inside. You stop trying after the first few rotations. Some things about this level of the job you learn are only ever going to be understood by the 2 other people who were down there with you. Level 7, the diving supervisor. You move to running the operation rather than working the bell yourself as often, responsible now for the lives of an entire saturation crew rather than just your own. Your pay crosses $200,000, and the job becomes as much about vigilance and judgment as it ever was about physical skill. Reading gas mixtures, weather windows, equipment checks, knowing when a job isn't safe to run today even when a client is paying enormously for every hour of delay. You make the call to abort a job partway through a rotation when equipment readings look subtly wrong to you, against real pressure from a client losing money on every hour of downtime, and you're right. A failure that would have been catastrophic at depth is caught and fixed on the surface instead. Nobody outside the crew ever hears about the disaster that didn't happen. Otis tells you, when you call him afterward still shaking slightly from the decision, that the best supervisors in this industry are measured entirely by catastrophes nobody will ever know they prevented. You spend most of this level learning a different kind of vigilance than diving itself ever asked of you, reading a room full of tired divers for the subtle signs of someone who shouldn't go down today, tracking weather windows that shift by the hour, holding the entire operation's safety in your head at once instead of just your own. You lose sleep over decisions nobody in the room besides you fully understands the weight of, and you start to recognize, in your own face, in a mirror some mornings, the specific, quiet exhaustion you used to see in supervisors twice your age back when you were still just a tender. You call Otis more often during this stretch than at any point since dive school, not for technical advice anymore, but for the specific reassurance that the weight of the job is supposed to feel this heavy, that it isn't a sign you're doing it wrong. He tells you, more than once, that he stepped back from supervising precisely because his own knee made the vigilance impossible to sustain alongside the pain, and that watching you carry it well is the closest thing to relief he's felt about leaving the role himself. Level 8, the Offshore Superintendent. You oversee entire offshore projects now, multiple crews, enormous budgets, months-long operations for oil companies who need work done at depths and under conditions almost nobody else on Earth is qualified to handle. Your compensation crosses $350,000, and the responsibility has expanded again. Not just the divers under you, but the entire operation's safety culture, built and maintained across crews you don't personally supervise every single day. You rewrite a safety protocol after a near miss on a crew you're not directly running, one that could have easily become the phone call you once received about your old classmate. And you push it through against real institutional resistance from people who consider the existing protocol expensive enough already. You sit through 3 separate meetings with executives who've never once been underwater themselves, translating what you know in your body into numbers they can put in a budget line. And you leave each one uncertain whether you've actually been understood or simply outlasted. It becomes standard across the company within 2 years. You never get public credit for it. You didn't do it for credit. You manage budgets now larger than some of the small companies you once worked for as a young offshore diver, and you spend more of your working hours in meetings and spreadsheets than anywhere near actual water, a trade you didn't fully anticipate when you signed up for a career that started with welding by feel in zero visibility. You miss the bell more than you expected to. You take an occasional supervised dive yourself, unnecessary for the role, purely because a version of you that started this career at 20 would never forgive the version of you running it now for staying dry entirely. Level 9. The Legend. There are a small number of names in commercial diving that younger divers learn before they've ever been in the water themselves. People whose careers spanned the entire arc of the industry's safety evolution, who trained the trainers, who are called in as consultants when something goes wrong anywhere in the world and a company needs someone who's actually seen every version of what can go wrong at depth. You are, after 4 decades, one of them. A fact that still feels faintly unreal on the mornings you're flown out to consult on an operation for a company that once wouldn't have returned your calls. Otis passed away 2 years ago, his old decompression injury having quietly cost him mobility for the last decade of his life in ways he never once complained about in front of you. You gave the eulogy because nobody in that room had known him in the water longer than you had, and you told the story about the 4 minutes you spent tangled in wreckage as a young surface diver, the one he always called your actual entrance exam, because it was the story he'd have wanted told, and because half the room, divers of every generation his career had touched, needed to hear that the industry's hardest lessons had always come wrapped in exactly that much gruffness and exactly that much care, in equal measure, whether they'd noticed it at the time or not. You've lost count of the decompression close calls across 4 decades, and you haven't lost count of the people the industry has lost outright, because that number stays exactly as precise in your memory as it did the day you first heard it about your old classmate. The question this world never quite lets you answer is the one that matters most: whether the money, real as it is, was ever really what kept you coming back to the water for 40 years, or whether it was something closer to what Otis tried to tell you on your very first day, the thing about respecting the water more than your own confidence, which turned out to be less a warning than a description of the only kind of person who survives long enough to become you, someone who never once, across 4 decades and 100 bell runs, stopped being a little afraid of the water, and simply learned to do the job well anyway. 9 ranks. From a $15,000 training loan and a check engine light you couldn't afford to fix, to the person oil companies call when nobody else on Earth is qualified to go down. If worlds like this pull you in, there's another one waiting next week. Subscribe, and I'll see you there.